Do you believe revenge can change the course of a continent's history? What if I told you the legend of a man thrown into a snake pit gave rise to one of the greatest invasions England ever saw, transforming its kingdoms and forging the very identity of a nation? For centuries, Vikings were seen only as barbaric raiders, a scourge from the sea. But that view is counterintuitive and hides a much more complex and fascinating truth. Get ready to unravel the mystery behind the Great Heathen Army, a force that sought not just gold, but land, power, and a legacy that would challenge kings and redefine borders. In minutes, you'll discover how a group of legendary brothers, driven by an unwavering belief in the revenge for their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, achieved the seemingly impossible, dismantling kingdoms, founding cities, and, paradoxically, paving the way for the unification of one of Europe's most powerful nations. If this story surprised you and piqued your curiosity, hit that like button to show us you want more content like this, and to help spread this knowledge to more people. And if this journey through the past captivated you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new chapters of this epic saga. Your engagement drives us to continue. Oh, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this fascinating story from? We want to know. Centuries before the Great Heathen Army landed on England's shores, the European continent, and particularly the British Isles, already felt the prelude of an implacable force emerging from the northern mists. The dawn of the Viking Age, often dated to the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD. It marked the beginning of a new phase of interactions, often violent between Norse societies and established Christian kingdoms. For almost a century, these initial incursions were largely sporadic raids. Small groups of warriors, driven by the quest for wealth, glory, and perhaps new lands, descended upon isolated monasteries and coastal villages, plundering treasures, capturing slaves, and disappearing as quickly as they appeared. England, then not a unified kingdom but a mosaic of 7 rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, was a particularly appealing target. These kingdoms, though nominally Christian and with nascent social and political structures, were often torn apart by internal disputes, dynastic wars, and power struggles, which made them vulnerable. The fragility of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was evident. There was no unified army, nor a coordinated defense strategy. Each king defended his own borders with local militias, or fyrds, composed of free men summoned for military service for a short period. While some kings, like Offa of Mercia and Ecgberht of Wessex, had managed to exert temporary hegemony over the others, this supremacy was fluid and frequently contested. The political landscape was in constant turmoil, with alliances forming and dissolving, and loyalty often depending on the strength and charisma of the ruler. This internal disunity, coupled with the lack of an Anglo-Saxon navy capable of intercepting fast and versatile Viking ships, created the perfect scenario for Norse expansion. Monasteries, filled with gold, silver, and relics, were easy and rich targets. The incursions, initially seen as isolated plagues, began to intensify in frequency and scale, transforming from simple raids into winter campaigns, where Vikings spent the season on English territory, consolidating positions and expanding their influence. This shift in tactics foreshadowed something much larger and more devastating: the desire not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. England, divided and unprepared, stood on the brink of a seismic transformation that would redefine its future forever. The story behind the Great Heathen Army, which would devastate England in the 9th century, is not just one of territorial ambition and the pursuit of wealth, but also, according to Norse sagas, one of deep and implacable vengeance. At the heart of this motivation stands the legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, a name that echoed terror and glory throughout Scandinavia. Although the historical existence of Ragnar, the singular individual, is debated by modern historians, some believe he is an amalgam of several Viking chieftains. His legend was, without a doubt, a powerful driving force for his supposed sons. Sagas portray him as a ruthless warrior, an audacious explorer, and a charismatic leader. whose incursions extended from Lindisfarne to Paris. However, his life, according to legend, would meet a tragic and brutal end at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. The most widespread narrative recounts that Ragnar, after being carried by currents in a shipwreck off the coast of Northumbria, was captured by King Ella. Instead of demanding a ransom or seeking an honorable surrender, Ella, in an act of defiance and cruelty, allegedly executed Ragnar in a particularly horrifying manner by throwing him into a pit full of venomous snakes. As he died, Ragnar is said to have uttered his famous last words, a challenge and a grim promise to his captors. "It is good for the old boars to know how the young pigs grunt, if they knew how the little pigs would revel." This phrase, loaded with symbolism, was a clear allusion to his sons, the little pigs, who would surely avenge his death. The news of his father's death and the humiliating way he perished is said to have reached the ears of his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, Halfdan, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, among others. While the saga is legendary and may have been created a posteriori to justify the massive invasion, the belief in Ragnar's revenge was an emotional catalyst for the unification of various chieftains and their armies under a single, formidable banner. For the Vikings, honor and vengeance were fundamental pillars of their culture. The death of a renowned leader, especially in such a dishonorable way, demanded an equally great retaliation. The idea that an Anglo-Saxon king dared to challenge and murder one of the greatest Norse warriors would have ignited a flame of fury and solidarity among the clans and warriors, encouraging them to join this just cause. This narrative of vengeance gave the Great Heathen Army not only a material objective, plunder and land, but also a moral and spiritual purpose, which made it even more cohesive and implacable. Thus, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, true or not in its details, became the war cry that united the greatest Viking chieftains into an unprecedented force, ready to unleash the fury of the North upon England. The spring of 865 AD witnessed an unprecedented event in Norse and Anglo-Saxon history, the convergence of a military force so vast and diverse that English chronicles would dub it the Mysel Heathen Heer, the Great Heathen Army. Far from being a unified army under a single supreme king, this army was, in fact, a formidable coalition of various Viking warbands, each under the leadership of their own charismatic and battle-hardened chieftains. These warriors and their commanders came from different parts of Scandinavia, including Denmark, Norway, and possibly some areas of Sweden, all drawn by the promise of plunder, land, and, crucially, by the vengeance for the supposed death of Ragnar Lothbrok. The leadership was multifaceted, but three names stood out, often described as brothers or figures with strong family ties. Ivar the Boneless, known for his cunning and cruelty. Ubba Ragnarson, an imposing warrior and executor of the army's decisions. And Halfdan Ragnarsson, a promising leader with ambitions of establishing his own kingdom. Besides them, other lesser chieftains and jarls, earls, with their own fleets and groups of warriors joined, increasing the critical mass of the invasion. The gathering of these diverse contingents was no accident. It represented an evolution in Viking tactics. Previous incursions were small-scale, swift and focused on plunder. The Great Heathen Army, on the other hand, was an enterprise of conquest, requiring complex logistical planning and unprecedented coordination. The logistics of gathering thousands of men, their ships, horses, which would be acquired in England, and supplies, demonstrated a level of organization and ambition never before seen from the Norse. This coalition reflected a tacit understanding among the leaders that disunity had limited the reach of past incursions. By joining forces, they could overwhelm any Anglo-Saxon resistance and establish lasting dominion. The objective was no longer just gold and silver, but control of fertile lands, the establishment of permanent settlements, and the imposition of their will upon England's fragmented kingdoms. The cohesion of the Great Heathen Army, though temporary and subject to internal disputes, was an existential threat to Anglo-Saxon England. It represented the culmination of decades of incursions, the learning of tactics, and the amplification of Norse ambitions. When this massive force set sail for England in 865 AD, they were not just common raiders, but potential conquerors, ready to rewrite the political map of the British Isles with blood and steel. The land waited, uncertain of the destiny that awaited it. The vastness of the Great Heathen Army's fleet, descending upon the misty waters of the North Sea, presented a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight to anyone who witnessed it. In the autumn of 865 AD, this formidable force landed on the shores of East Anglia, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that made up England at the time. The choice of landing site was not random. East Anglia was a coastal kingdom, with access to navigable rivers that would allow penetration inland, and, crucially, it was a less powerful kingdom than Wessex or Mercia, making it an easier target for establishing an initial base. The surprise was absolute. Although Viking incursions had been a reality for decades, the scale and nature of this new arrival were of unprecedented magnitude. The Anglo-Saxons were accustomed to hit-and-run raids, swift and localized. What they saw now was an avalanche. Thousands of warriors disembarked, not with the intention of a quick raid and departure, but of establishing a lasting presence. The local fyrds, the militias summoned by the kings, were totally unprepared to face such a numerous and organized force. The lack of a centralized defense system and the political fragmentation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms meant that each king was, to a large extent, responsible for his own defense. When the Great Heathen Army appeared in East Anglia, the local king, Edmund, and his people were caught off guard. With no time to mobilize an effective resistance, the speed and efficiency of the disembarkation and the setting up of the Viking camp were impressive. The longships, capable of navigating shallow waters, allowed the warriors to reach the shores directly, unload their equipment, and establish a beachhead in a matter of hours. After landing, the Vikings quickly established a fortified encampment somewhere inland in East Anglia. Although sources do not specify the exact location, it is believed to have been at a strategic point that allowed them to control the region and prepare for subsequent campaigns. The army's arrival was not just a military invasion. It was a cultural and psychological shock. News spread rapidly to the other kingdoms, generating panic and uncertainty. The perception that these heathens were no longer mere raiders, but a conquering force, began to solidify. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were forced to face a new reality, that of an existential threat that would demand a unified and unprecedented response, something that, unfortunately for them, would still take time to emerge. East Anglia, defenseless, became the first great stage for the brutality and ambition of the Great Heathen Army, a grim omen of what was to follow. Among the leaders of the fearsome Great Heathen Army, one name echoed with particular reverence and dread: Ivar the Boneless. His figure, shrouded in mystery and legend, is consistently portrayed in sagas and Anglo-Saxon chronicles as the mastermind behind the army's operations, the architect of its most devastating victories. While the exact reason for his nickname, the Boneless, is debated, it could refer to a physical condition, like osteogenesis imperfecta, which gave him brittle bones, or perhaps an unusual physical flexibility, or even a metaphorical representation of his agility and lack of scruples. His sharp mind for military strategy and political tactics was undeniable. Ivar was not the strongest warrior or the most brutal on the front lines, but rather the most cunning, the one who thought several steps ahead of his adversaries. From the landing in East Anglia in 865 AD, Ivar demonstrated his tactical genius. He not only led raids but orchestrated entire campaigns with surgical precision. His ability to assess enemy weaknesses, exploit Anglo-Saxon disunity, and employ innovative siege tactics was legendary. While other Viking leaders might be driven by the fury of battle, Ivar was cold and calculating. His strategy often involved manipulating alliances, sowing discord among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and using efficient siege tactics to subdue fortified cities. He understood the importance of mobility. Although the Vikings were primarily naval warriors, Ivar recognized the need for an agile land army, and for this reason, the Great Heathen Army quickly began acquiring horses, becoming a hybrid force capable of covering great distances and outflanking enemies. The campaign against Northumbria, and in particular the conquest of York, are striking examples of his acumen. Instead of directly attacking York's defenses, Ivar waited for the opportune moment, when the Northumbrian nobles were divided by civil war, to launch his attack. He knew how to exploit the rivalry between Kings Osbert and Ella, attacking when they were at their most vulnerable. The annihilation of a significant portion of the Northumbrian nobility and the imposition of a puppet king, Egbert, demonstrate his long-term vision, not just to plunder, but to dismantle the existing political structure and establish lasting control. The brutality associated with Ivar, such as the alleged execution of Ella of Northumbria by the Blood Eagle ritual, a Viking torture method of debated historicity, but terrifying nonetheless, served to consolidate his power and instill dread in the hearts of his enemies. Ivar's presence meant that the Great Heathen Army was not a mere horde of raiders. It was an intelligent war machine, led by a ruthless strategist who would not hesitate to use any means necessary to achieve his objectives. While his brothers and other chieftains focused on battle, Ivar planned the next move, envisioning the conquest and colonization in a way that would change the course of English history forever. He was, without a doubt, the mastermind who transformed the revenge of a legendary father into a nascent empire. If Ivar the Boneless was the strategic mind behind the Great Heathen Army, then Ubba Ragnarson represented the raw force, the relentless face of execution and terror. Frequently mentioned in Anglo-Saxon chronicles and Norse sagas alongside his brothers Ivar and Halfdan, Ubba was the embodiment of Viking ferocity in its most visceral form. He wasn't known for his tactical subtleties, but rather for his ability to lead troops in direct combat, his unwavering courage, and occasionally, for a cruelty that would become a hallmark of the invasion. While Ivar wove the webs of strategy, Ubba was the hammer that struck them, crushing resistance with an almost uncontrollable momentum. His presence in the Great Heathen Army was fundamental to implementing Ivar's plans. Ubba was the leader who inspired warriors through personal example in battle, fighting on the vanguard, and driving the army to victory. Accounts describe him as a man of great stature and strength, whose war cries were enough to chill the blood of his enemies. In many of the initial campaigns, especially in the devastation of East Anglia and the taking of Northumbria, Ubba played a crucial role. He was the commander who ensured that cities fell and that Anglo-Saxon resistance was suffocated with brutality. The cruelty attributed to the Vikings, such as the destruction of monasteries and the killing of clerics, was often associated with figures like Ubba, who did not hesitate to use terror as a tool to break the morale of adversaries and impose Norse dominion. Ubba's participation in the Saga of St. Edmund, King of East Anglia, is a vivid example of his image. While the historicity of the details may vary, the legend describes Ubba as Edmund's chief executioner. After Edmund's refusal to renounce his Christian faith and become a Viking puppet king, Ubba, or Ivar, depending on the source, allegedly ordered his death by arrows, like a hedgehog, until his body was covered in them, and subsequently his decapitation. This story, even if partially mythologized, served to cement Ubba's reputation as a merciless warrior, an enforcer of the Great Heathen Army's darkest wills. His name became synonymous with destruction and subjugation for the Anglo-Saxons. Despite his prominent role in the early phases of the invasion, Ubba's ultimate fate is somewhat uncertain compared to his brothers. Irish sources mention him in subsequent campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, and some English chronicles associate him with a group of Vikings who landed in Devon in 878 AD, only to be defeated and killed by Wessex forces at the Battle of Sinwit. In that confrontation, the legendary Raven Banner, the Rifan, a symbol of Viking luck and power, which many believed had been woven by Ragnar Lothbrok's own daughters, was said to have been captured. Ubba Ragnarson, therefore, embodies the most fearsome face of the Great Heathen Army, that of the relentless warrior who, through his strength and determination, paved the way for the Viking conquest of England. He was the materialization of the fury of the North, an elemental force that turned fear into reality for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Among the formidable sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, whether legendary or historical, Halfdan Ragnarsson emerges as a prominent figure, not only for his participation in the Great Heathen Army, but for his undeniable ambition to establish his own kingdom, distinguishing himself from his brothers who were more focused on conquest strategy, Ivar, or pure battle strength, Ubbi. While sagas often place him as Ivar and Ubbi's brother, Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention him as one of the main leaders of the army, indicating his prominent position and command capability. Halfdan was a pragmatic leader with a vision that went beyond mere raiding and plundering. He desired land, power, and the establishment of a new Viking order in England. From the Great Heathen Army's first movements, Halfdan was present in the most crucial campaigns. His leadership ability and his skill in maintaining cohesion among the warriors were essential for the success of operations. Unlike Ivar, who seemed more interested in orchestrating and manipulating, Halfdan was a leader who actively participated in battles, inspiring his men with his own courage. He was not just an enforcer, but a strategist who formulated plans in conjunction with his brothers, contributing to the army's relentless advance through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Halfdan's ambition began to manifest more clearly as the Great Heathen Army consolidated its victories. While Ivar and Ubbe seemed content with dismantling kingdoms and extracting tribute, Danegeld, Halfdan envisioned a permanent settlement. This vision was crucial as it marked a significant transition in Viking intentions, from temporary invaders to potential colonizers. He realized that lasting control would come not only from military might, but from establishing his own political and social infrastructure. His prominence grew throughout the campaigns, especially after the annihilation of Northumbria and the subjugation of York. While the Great Heathen Army moved towards Wessex, the part of the army led by Halfdan began to focus on consolidating control over the already conquered lands. This strategic division of forces, with Halfdan leading the consolidation in the north and Ivar Ubbi focusing on the south, demonstrated his autonomy and the recognition of his ability to govern. He was not just a warrior, but a king aspirant, seeking a throne in the fertile lands of England, a destiny he would soon achieve by becoming the first Viking king of Jorvik. His ambition was not just for wealth, but for dynasty and legacy, which set him apart and elevated him to the status of a truly regal figure within the pantheon of Viking leaders. The city of Eoforwic, the ancient capital of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria, was a vital center of power, culture, and trade in the 9th century. Heavily walled and strategically located, it seemed a bastion of resistance against Viking incursions. However, its fall in 866 AD to the Great Heathen Army, led by figures like Ivar and Halfdan, was not merely a military triumph, but a turning point that sealed the fate of much of northern England and marked the beginning of a new era. The story of York's capture is a testament to Viking cunning and Anglo-Saxon disunity. At the time of the invasion, Northumbria was plunged into civil war. Two men, Osbert and Ella, disputed the throne, fatally weakening the kingdom. While the factions fought among themselves, the Great Heathen Army, which had arrived in East Anglia the previous year, moved swiftly north, targeting Northumbria. The Vikings could not have chosen a more opportune moment. On November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, the army attacked Eoforwic, catching the Anglo-Saxon garrison by surprise and conquering the city with relative ease. The date, a Christian holiday, may have been intentionally chosen to maximize the element of surprise and demoralize the defenders. News of their capital's fall shocked rival kings Osbert and Ella. In a rare moment of unity against a common enemy, they agreed to a truce and combined their forces to try and retake the city. On March 21st, 867 AD, the Anglo-Saxons launched a massive counterattack against York. The battle was fierce and bloody. However, the Vikings, well entrenched and led by experienced commanders like Ivar, repelled the assault. Both Osbert and Ella were killed in battle, eliminating Northumbria's Anglo-Saxon leadership and leaving the kingdom leaderless. There are legends that claim Ella was captured and executed with the Blood Eagle ritual by Ivar, in retribution for Ragnar Lothbrok's death, although the historicity of this ritual is debated among historians, it being more likely that he died in combat. With victory secured, the Vikings not only occupied York but transformed it. The city of Eoforwic was reborn as Jorvik, a vibrant center of Viking power and, subsequently, an important commercial hub within the growing Danelaw. Anglo-Saxon structures were adapted, and the city became a permanent base for future campaigns. Coins minted in Jorvik, the surrounding Scandinavian settlements, and archaeological evidence of Viking life in the city, such as the excavations at Coppergate, attest to the depth and permanence of the transformation. Jorvik was not just a fortress, it was a capital, a market, and a symbol of Norse dominion over northern England. Its fall represented the end of Anglo-Saxon autonomy in Northumbria and the beginning of an era of Viking settlement and governance, which would shape the region's identity for centuries. The fall of York in 866 AD and the subsequent defeat and death of Kings Osbert and Ella in the Battle of 867 AD marked not only the loss of a strategic city, but the beginning of the systematic annihilation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. The Vikings of the Great Heathen Army, under Ivar's cunning leadership and Halfdan's strength, were not content with plunder. Their objective was to dismantle the existing political structure and impose permanent dominion over the region. Northumbria, one of the oldest and once most powerful kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, with a rich history of scholarship and art, was reduced to a shadow of its former glory. With the death of its legitimate monarchs, the kingdom was in disarray. The Vikings, demonstrating remarkable political intelligence, did not opt for immediate direct occupation of the entire territory. Instead, they installed a puppet king, Egbert I, to govern the southern part of Northumbria, which would be known as Dara. This Egbert was not an independent ruler. He was a Viking pawn, a means to extract tribute and maintain order with a facade of Anglo-Saxon legitimacy, while the true masters of the kingdom were the Norse conquerors. This strategy allowed the Vikings to consolidate their power without needing to directly govern every settlement, while they continued to plunder and prepare for future campaigns. Northumbria, already weakened by decades of internal conflicts and earlier Viking incursions, lacked the capacity to recover. The Anglo-Saxon elites were dispersed or subjugated. Great monasteries, centers of wealth and culture, like those of Wearmouth and Jarrow, which had been pillars of intellectual and religious life in Northumbria, were attacked, plundered, and, in many cases, destroyed. This destruction was not just material, it was a cultural devastation, erasing records, books, and symbols of a golden age. The fertile land was redistributed among the Viking warriors, marking the beginning of a process of agrarian settlement. The northern part of Northumbria, known as Bernicia, also felt the impact, though with a different form of control. Some of its leaders, like Ragnvald Godfreyson, maintained a certain autonomy, but under the shadow of Viking hegemony. The annihilation was not just military but political, economic, and cultural. The imposition of Norse laws and customs, the minting of coins with Viking symbols, and the growing population of Scandinavian settlers permanently transformed the landscape. Northumbria, as an independent and cohesive Anglo-Saxon kingdom, ceased to exist. In its place emerged a new power, with Jorvik as its heart, a Viking kingdom that would become one of the pillars of the future Danelaw, the territory of England under Norse control. This disintegration set a grim precedent for the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, who now saw the Vikings' relentless ability not just to plunder, but to conquer and rule. The history of the Great Heathen Army in England is filled with violence and conquest, but one episode in particular stands out for its legendary brutality and its lasting impact on Anglo-Saxon memory: the saga and subsequent martyrdom of St. Edmund, King of East Anglia. While the exact details of his death vary among sources, the essence of the account is that of a Christian king who refused to bow to the heathen invaders, becoming a symbol of resistance and faith. After the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, Edmund's kingdom was the first to feel the Vikings' relentless fury. With no time to organize an effective defense, King Edmund was quickly subdued. Chronicles and sagas, such as the Passio Sancti Edmundi by Abbot Abbo of Fleury, written over a century later, but based on older accounts, describe a desperate situation for the young king. Captured by the Vikings who were preparing to winter in the kingdom, Edmund was confronted by the Norse leaders, supposedly Ivar the Boneless and Ubba Ragnarson. Legend has it that the Vikings offered Edmund the chance to remain king, but on the condition that he become a vassal and renounce his Christian faith. Edmund, a deeply religious man, vehemently refused, declaring he would rather die than dishonor Christ or his subjects. His refusal sealed his fate. Enraged by his defiance and refusal to submit, the Vikings allegedly tied him to a tree and flogged him. The method of execution, according to legend, was particularly cruel. He was supposedly shot with a shower of arrows, like a hedgehog, until his body was covered in them. After this, his head was allegedly cut off and thrown into a nearby thicket, ensuring there would be no Christian burial. The legend continues with a miraculous touch. After the Vikings departed, Edmund's loyal subjects supposedly found his head being guarded by a wolf, which gently returned it to be reunited with his body. This story, though containing hagiographic elements to sanctify the king, highlights the brutality of the Viking invasion and the strength of Christian faith in the face of a pagan enemy. The date of his death is traditionally accepted as November 20th, 869 AD. The Saga of St. Edmund had a profound impact on the Anglo-Saxon imagination and on subsequent England. He became a venerated martyr and saint whose cult grew exponentially. His burial place at Bury St. Edmunds, named in his honor, became an important pilgrimage center. The story of his martyrdom served as a powerful symbol of Christian resistance against pagan barbarity, inspiring generations and cementing the image of the Vikings as enemies of faith and civilization. This narrative, even with its legendary embellishments, reflects the reality of the terror and devastation that the Great Heathen Army brought with it, and the deep faith that, for some, was the only defense against the encroaching darkness. While the Great Heathen Army consolidated its dominion over Northumbria and East Anglia, a last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance rose in the south of England, the Kingdom of Wessex. Led by King Ethelred, the elder brother of the future Alfred the Great, Wessex was the most prosperous, militarily capable, and politically stable kingdom of the remaining Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. Its geography, with natural defenses and a strong military tradition, made it a more formidable challenge than the kingdoms that had already fallen. However, the threat was existential. The Vikings, with the confidence of their victories and the ambition to conquer all of England, turned their gaze toward Wessex. The year 870 AD marked the beginning of the Viking assault on Wessex. The Great Heathen Army, already with years of campaigning experience and a reputation for invincibility, advanced into the heart of the kingdom. King Ethelred, along with his younger brother and presumptive heir Alfred, knew that the fate of their kingdom, and perhaps that of all Anglo-Saxon England, depended on their ability to resist. Unlike the kings who preceded them, Ethelred and Alfred demonstrated a rare unity and determination. They did not flee, nor did they submit to humiliating treaties without first fighting. The burden of defending Christianity and Anglo-Saxon culture rested on their shoulders. Wessex's resistance was not an easy or continuous victory. The Vikings were relentless, well-armed, and determined. They attacked repeatedly, testing Anglo-Saxon defenses and morale. Ethelred and Alfred's strategy was to mobilize the feared, the local militia, continuously, even if it meant exhausting the kingdom's resources and population. The campaigns were brutal, with bloody pitched battles and sieges of towns. With each Viking thrust, Ethelred and Alfred were there, leading their troops and trying to repel the invaders. Wessex became the stage for a war of attrition, where Anglo-Saxon perseverance was confronted with Norse aggression. Ethelred's ability to maintain his kingdom's cohesion under such pressure was remarkable, but the cost was immense. Lands were devastated, harvests lost, and the suffering of the population was widespread. Each victory was hard-won, and each defeat, though not fatal, sapped morale. The Kingdom of Wessex under Ethelred was not just a territory to be defended, it was the last flicker of hope for Anglo-Saxon England, and its resistance would become the prelude to the rise of one of the greatest kings in English history. The struggle was desperate, but the flame still burned. The year 871 AD would be forever etched in Wessex's memory as the year of the 9 battles, a period of unparalleled intensity in the struggle against the Great Heathen Army. The Viking pressure on Ethelred and Alfred's kingdom was relentless, and each confrontation was a trial by fire for Anglo-Saxon survival. Although many Viking leaders were involved in these campaigns, Halfdan Ragnarsson distinguished himself as one of the most prominent commanders and a formidable adversary for the Saxons. The series of battles began early in the year, with the Vikings advancing into Wessex territory. One of the first and most important was the Battle of Reading in January. The Vikings, having established a fortified camp at the confluence of the rivers Thames and Kennet, managed to repel an Anglo-Saxon attack led by Ethelred and Alfred. The defeat was a setback for the Saxons, but it did not demoralize them. A few days later, retaliation would come in full force. The climax of the 871 campaign was the Battle of Ashdown, occurring around January 8th. The Anglo-Saxon forces, again led by the royal brothers, confronted the Vikings in open battle. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe the battle as particularly fierce. The Viking army was divided into two wings, one under the command of Halfdan and the other under Guthrum, or another prominent chieftain. According to legend, while Ethelred was praying, Alfred took the initiative, leading a desperate charge against Halfdan's Viking line. He charged like a wild boar, a chronicle would describe, highlighting the young prince's bravery. The legend of Alfred attacking without his brother who was praying is an epic moment that demonstrates the urgency and heroism of the moment. The battle was a slaughter for both sides, but the Anglo-Saxon forces achieved a crucial victory, forcing the Vikings to retreat. The defeat at Ashdown was a shock to the Great Heathen Army, demonstrating that Wessex would not be an easy target. However, the victory at Ashdown was followed by more confrontations. The attritional nature of Anglo-Saxon warfare meant that, even after victories, the field needed to be replenished. The Vikings, with their ability to bring in reinforcements and their persistence, quickly reorganized. Battles at Basing and Meryton followed, where the Anglo-Saxons, despite showing bravery, could not replicate the success of Ashdown and suffered heavy losses. At Meryton, even Bishop Haemund of Sherborne himself was killed. The series of battles in 871 AD, while not resulting in the definitive expulsion of the Vikings, was fundamental. It demonstrated the resilience of Wessex and the ability of Ethelred and Alfred to face the greatest threat England had ever seen. For Halfdan, these confrontations were a lesson in the tenacity of his adversaries and solidified his reputation as a ruthless field commander, even when confronted with the fiercest resistance. The year ended with a precarious armistice, but the stage was set for the next chapters in Wessex's struggle for survival. The Year of the Nine Battles, 871 AD, had been a period of unparalleled trials for the Kingdom of Wessex. Despite the victory at Ashdown, the continuous pressure from the Great Heathen Army and the exhausting nature of the war took their toll. Amidst this chaos and uncertainty, in April 871 AD, King Ethelred of Wessex died. Chronicles do not specify the exact cause of his death, whether it was from battle wounds, illness, or exhaustion, but it is certain that he succumbed at a critical moment for his kingdom. His death left a leadership vacuum in a period of existential crisis. The succession to the throne of Wessex was not simple. Ethelred had children, but they were too young to take command of a kingdom at war. Anglo-Saxon law allowed the assembly of nobles, the Witan, to choose the king, and the need for a strong, battle-hardened leader was pressing. Thus, in a moment of consensus and urgency, the mantle of royalty fell upon the shoulders of his younger brother, Prince Alfred. Alfred, though still young for a monarch, he was about 22, had already proven his courage and military acumen by fighting alongside Ethelred in the battles of the previous year. He was the logical choice, the man capable of uniting Wessex's defenses and confronting the Viking threat. Alfred's ascension to the throne, however, did not bring immediate relief to the kingdom. On the contrary, his coronation occurred amidst one of the worst crises Wessex had ever faced. The Vikings were still in their territory, demanding tribute and threatening new incursions. Alfred's first action as king was, in fact, to make peace with the Great Heathen Army, paying a considerable sum of Danegeld, Danish money, for them to leave Wessex. This was a pragmatic decision, not a surrender. Alfred knew his kingdom was exhausted and needed time to recover and reorganize. He used this brief period of forced peace to plan and strengthen Wessex's defenses. Ethelred's death and Alfred's ascension mark a watershed. Ethelred was a courageous king who fought tirelessly, but it was Alfred who inherited the burden of protecting Wessex, and by extension, the future of Anglo-Saxon England. His reign would be defined by the relentless struggle against the Norse invaders, by the reformulation of the kingdom's defenses, and eventually, by the consolidation of a stronger English identity. The era of defensive resistance would give way, under Alfred, to an era of counteroffensive and unification. The chaos of war had forged a new leader, one who would be remembered as the Great. The crown, heavy and full of challenges, was now on Alfred's head, and the fate of a nation rested in his hands. The first years of the Great Heathen Army in England, starting in 865 AD, were marked by a strategy of plunder and tribute imposition. The Vikings moved rapidly between kingdoms, looting riches and forcing Anglo-Saxon kings to pay considerable sums of Danegeld to secure temporary peace. However, after years of campaigns and victories, including the disintegration of Northumbria and East Anglia, and the exhausting war against Wessex in 871 AD, the Great Heathen Army's strategy began to shift radically. The quest for territory and the desire for permanent settlement became the new driving force of their actions. This transition was not abrupt, but gradual, driven by various factors. Firstly, the very nature of the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of diverse chieftains and warriors, demanded a more substantial reward than just gold and silver. Many of the Norse warriors who had left their homelands in search of fortune realized that England offered not only riches, but also fertile and unexplored lands, much more appealing than the rocky lands of Scandinavia. The desire to establish farms, build communities, and live more stably began to supersede the mindset of mere raiders. Furthermore, Anglo-Saxon resistance, especially that of Wessex under Alfred the Great, demonstrated that total conquest through constant plunder would be a long and exhausting process. The imposition of Danegeld was a temporary solution. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once recovered, could refuse payments and resume war. Settlement offered a more sustainable way of control and resource exploitation. By becoming landowners, the Vikings could consolidate their power, extract taxes, and build a solid base for their future operations. The first major evidence of this shift in strategy came in 876 AD, when Halfdan Ragnarsson, one of the army's main leaders, decided to settle his part of the army in Northumbria, becoming King of Jorvik, York. This was a crucial moment, as it marked the first time a large Viking contingent permanently settled and began to cultivate the land. Other leaders followed suit. In 877 AD, a portion of the army settled in Mercia, near Repton, and in 880 AD, Guthrum, another important Viking leader, signed the Treaty of Wedmore with Alfred, promising to convert to Christianity and settle in East Anglia. This shift from plunder to settlement had profound consequences. It transformed the Viking invaders into colonizers, and eventually into an intrinsic part of the English landscape. The areas where they settled, which would become known as the Danelaw, developed a hybrid culture, with Norse laws, place names, and customs mixing with Anglo-Saxon ones. The quest for territory was not just a military strategy, it was a fundamental step in the formation of England's identity, a process that would last for centuries and leave an indelible mark on the nation. After years of brutal campaigns and conquests across England, the Great Heathen Army, that vast and powerful coalition of Viking warriors, reached a tipping point in the mid-870s AD. The strategy of plunder and tribute, while lucrative, didn't offer the long-term stability many of its leaders now desired. It was in this context that the army, which had until then operated in relative cohesion, though with multiple leaders, began to divide. The catalyst for this fragmentation was Halfdan Ragnarsson's ambition to consolidate control over Northumbria and establish a permanent kingdom. In 875 AD, the main bulk of the Great Heathen Army, under the leadership of Guthrum, Ubbi, and other chieftains, moved south, focusing their energies on subjugating Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. However, Halfdan, who had been one of the most prominent commanders since the beginning of the invasion, made a different decision. He recognized the potential of Northumbria, a kingdom that had already been largely dismantled by the Vikings in the Battle of York in 867 AD. and which offered fertile lands and strategic ports. His vision went beyond plunder. He wanted to rule. Thus, Halfdan led a significant portion of the Great Heathen Army north, back to Jorvik, York, the ancient capital of Northumbria that the Vikings had conquered and transformed into their center of power. This faction, composed of warriors who shared his vision of settlement and perhaps were already tired of the nomadic life of continuous campaigns, decided to put down roots. Halfdan's decision to separate from the main body of the army demonstrated not only his autonomy and authority, but also an evolution in Viking strategic thinking. It was the transition from wandering warband tactics to governance and colonization. The consolidation of Northumbria's control under Halfdan involved subjugating the last pockets of Anglo-Saxon resistance and organizing the lands for settlement. He began distributing land to his warriors, encouraging them to become farmers and integrate into the local economy. This act was crucial for the formation of what would become known as the Danelaw, the area of England under Viking law and dominion. The division of the Great Heathen Army, with Halfdan establishing himself in the north, allowed the other part of the army, under Guthrum, to concentrate its efforts on Wessex, without needing to divide resources on multiple fronts. Halfdan wasn't just founding a kingdom, he was creating a precedent. He was the first of the Great Army's prominent leaders to translate military conquests into lasting political power and territorial settlement. This change marked the end of the purely invasive phase of the Viking Age in England and the beginning of the colonization phase, a period that would leave an indelible mark on England's culture, laws, and landscape. After the division of the Great Heathen Army and his strategic decision to focus on consolidating Northumbria, Halfdan Ragnarsson took a decisive step in 876 AD. He declared himself King of Jorvik, York, formally establishing himself as the first Viking ruler of what had been the capital of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria. This was not merely an act of conquest, but an act of foundation, a landmark in the history of Viking occupation in England. By assuming the title of king, Halfdan not only solidified his authority over the warriors who followed him, but also initiated a dynasty and a period of Norse governance over a significant portion of the island. The choice of Jorvik as his capital was both strategic and symbolic. The city, already fortified and an important Anglo-Saxon commercial and administrative center, offered a solid base for the new Viking kingdom. Under Halfdan's rule, Jorvik was no longer just a military encampment, but a city in transformation. Although Anglo-Saxon chronicles often describe him as a pagan king, the reality of his rule was more complex. He needed some form of legitimacy and stability to govern a mixed population of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. Halfdan's rule in Jorvik was characterized by organization and settlement. He began distributing lands among his warriors and followers, encouraging them to become farmers and integrate into the local economy. This process of colonization was fundamental for the new kingdom's sustainability. The minting of coins with his name and Norse symbols is strong archaeological evidence of his sovereignty and the institutionalization of Viking power in Jorvik. These coins, found in various locations, demonstrate that his reign had an administrative and economic infrastructure. However, Halfdan's ambition was not limited to Jorvik and its surroundings. The northern part of Northumbria, Bernicia, still maintained a certain autonomy under local Anglo-Saxon rulers. Halfdan, in his quest for total dominion, led military campaigns against these leaders, attempting to extend his control over all of Old Northumbria. These campaigns, though not always entirely successful, reaffirmed his authority and his kingdom's aspirations. Halfdan's reign as King of Jorvik, though relatively brief, was crucial. He laid the groundwork for a lasting Viking presence in England. His example inspired other Viking leaders, like Guthrum in East Anglia, to seek settlement and governance rather than just plunder. The founding of the Kingdom of Jorvik by Halfdan marked the genesis of the Danelaw, an area of England that for centuries would have a distinct cultural, legal, and political identity, deeply influenced by the Norse. He was the architect of a new type of Viking power, one that transformed invaders into rulers, and his mark would be felt in northern England for generations. With the consolidation of Viking power in regions like Northumbria, Under the leadership of Halfdan Ragnarsson, and later in East Anglia and parts of Mercia, a new and decisive phase of the Viking Age in England began: colonization. This was no longer a matter of isolated military incursions, but of a large-scale migratory movement, where thousands of Scandinavian settlers, including retired warriors, their families, and even landless peasants, began to arrive to work the land and establish permanent roots. This colonization was driven by a combination of factors. For the warriors who had fought for years, the promise of fertile lands in England was a tangible and lasting reward. Far from the often rocky and overpopulated lands of Scandinavia, England offered new agricultural and social opportunities. Land ownership conferred status and security, something many would not have had in their homelands. For the general Scandinavian populations, news of the conquered lands and the available wealth in England created a powerful incentive for migration. The Domesday Book, compiled centuries later, still reveals a high concentration of Norse origin place names in the Danelaw areas, clear evidence of the vast scale of settlement. The colonization process involved the distribution of land by Viking leaders, like Halfdan, to their followers. These new landowners, who were often warriors, began to settle, cultivate the land, and build communities. Colonization was not necessarily an act of mass expulsion of the Anglo-Saxons. In many cases, it was a process of coexistence and integration. Viking settlers established themselves alongside existing Anglo-Saxon populations, and, over time, there was a significant degree of intermarriage and acculturation. The arrival of these settlers brought with it Old Norse, which mixed with Old English, influencing vocabulary and grammar. Countless modern English words, especially those related to agriculture, legal terms, and place names, such as suffixes like by from farm and thorp from village, have Norse origins, a direct testament to the depth of the colonization. Furthermore, Viking laws and customs were introduced and mixed with Anglo-Saxon laws, forming what would become known as the Danelaw, an area with a distinct legal and administrative system. Viking colonization irreversibly transformed England's cultural and demographic landscape. It created a new identity for the northern and eastern regions, an identity that was both Anglo-Saxon and Norse. Future generations would be a fusion of these two cultures, and the legacy of Viking colonization would continue to shape England long after the end of the Viking Age. This was the true materialization of the Vikings' desire, not just to plunder, but to conquer, settle, and build a new home. The arrival and subsequent settlement of the Vikings in England, especially in centers like Jorvik, York, were not merely acts of military conquest. Over time, relations between the Norse invaders and the native Anglo-Saxon populations began to evolve from a state of conflict to one of interaction and cultural fusion. Although Viking dominance was imposed by force, the reality of daily life demanded a form of coexistence, and from this coexistence emerged the first signs of a hybrid society. In Jorvik, the capital of Halfdan Ragnarsson's kingdom and later of other Viking kings, this fusion was particularly evident. The Vikings did not completely eradicate Anglo-Saxon culture. Instead, the two cultures began to influence each other. One of the clearest signs of this interaction is language. Although Old Norse was the language of the conquerors, Old English continued to be spoken by the native population. Over time, words and grammatical structures from both languages began to mix. Countless Norse words such as sky, leg, anger, fellow, a knife, take, and ugly became incorporated into the English vocabulary, demonstrating the deep linguistic influence. Grammar was also affected, contributing to the transition from Old English to Middle English. Beyond language, cultural fusion could be seen in other aspects of life. The law in the Danelaw, the area under Viking rule, was a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Norse customs and laws. For example, the institution of the wapentake, a type of local administrative subdivision of Viking origin, coexisted with the hundred, the Anglo-Saxon unit. In the courts, Norse legal practices, such as the law wager oath, where the honesty of a party was attested by a number of jurors, mingled with Anglo-Saxon procedures. Religious life also underwent transformations. Although the Vikings were initially pagan, Many eventually converted to Christianity, either out of genuine conviction or political convenience, such as Guthrum's baptism after the Treaty of Wedmore. This conversion led to the construction of new churches and the restoration of existing ones, adapting them to their new realities. Art and craftsmanship also reveal this fusion. Objects found in archaeological excavations in York show a mix of Norse and Anglo-Saxon artistic styles. Coins minted in Jorvik frequently featured a mix of Christian and pagan symbols, reflecting the religious transition. The economy prospered with the interaction. The Vikings, known for their extensive trade routes, revitalized commerce in Jorvik, transforming it into a bustling port and trade center that connected England to Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. The introduction of new agricultural techniques and the settlement of a large number of Viking farmers also boosted food production. The cultural fusion in Jorvik and other parts of the Danelaw was not just a peaceful phenomenon. It was a complex process, with moments of tension and adaptation, but one that, in the long run, created a rich and vibrant society whose Norse roots can still be felt in modern England. It was a forced symbiosis that, nonetheless, generated a new cultural identity. After its conquest in 866 AD, and the subsequent elevation of Halfdan Ragnarsson to king, the city of Jorvik, York, rapidly became the pulsating heart of Viking dominion in northern England. Its transformation from an ancient Anglo-Saxon capital to a thriving Viking capital and fortress was an ambitious project, fundamental to the consolidation of Norse power in the region that would come to be known as the Danelaw. The fortification of Jorvik was not just a defensive measure, but a declaration of intent. The Vikings were there to stay. Jorvik's strategic location, at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, already made it naturally defensible. However, under Viking control, its defenses were significantly enhanced. Existing Roman and Anglo-Saxon walls were repaired, reinforced, and in some places, extended. The Vikings were pragmatic military engineers, and they knew how to adapt existing structures to their own needs. Ditches were deepened, earthworks were built, and wooden towers may have been erected to increase the city's defensive capacity. These fortifications were crucial for protecting the growing Viking and Anglo-Saxon population, as well as the goods and wealth flowing into the city. In addition to being a military fortress, Jorvik was developed as a political capital and a vibrant economic center. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate, in the heart of modern York, have revealed a bustling and prosperous city. The urban structure was reorganized to accommodate the needs of the new inhabitants. Workshops for craftsmanship, trade, and production flourished. Trade with Scandinavia, the European continent, and even other parts of England intensified. The artisans produced goods of metal, leather, wood, and textiles, many of which reflected a fusion of Norse and Anglo-Saxon artistic styles. The minting of coins in Jorvik, initiated under Halfdan and continued by his successors, is direct evidence of its status as a capital. These coins, often featuring both Christian symbols, like the cross, and pagan ones, like Thor's hammer, demonstrate the economic and political autonomy of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik. The city attracted merchants, settlers, and warriors, transforming it into a cultural melting pot where Norse language, laws, and customs mixed and adapted to those of the native Anglo-Saxon population. The fortification and development of Jorvik as a capital not only ensured the security of the Viking kingdom, but also solidified its legitimacy and permanence. It became a symbol of Norse power in England, a city that, even after the Anglo-Saxon reconquest centuries later, would maintain a tangible Viking legacy. It was the most concrete proof of the shift from an era of plunder to an era of settlement and governance, a testament to the vision of leaders like Halfdan Ragnarsson to build a new empire from the ashes of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The history of the Great Heathen Army in England is filled with violence and conquest, but one episode in particular stands out for its legendary brutality and its lasting impact on Anglo-Saxon memory: the Saga and subsequent martyrdom of St. Edmund, King of East Anglia. While the exact details of his death vary among sources, the essence of the account is that of a Christian king who refused to bow to the heathen invaders, becoming a symbol of resistance and faith. After the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, Edmund's kingdom was the first to feel the Vikings' relentless fury. With no time to organize an effective defense, King Edmund was quickly subdued. Chronicles and sagas, such as the Passio Sancti Edmundi by Abbot Abbo of Fleury, written over a century later, but based on older accounts, describe a desperate situation for the young king. Captured by the Vikings who were preparing to winter in the kingdom, Edmund was confronted by the Norse leaders, supposedly Ivar the Boneless and Ubba Ragnarson. Legend has it that the Vikings offered Edmund the chance to remain king, but on the condition that he become a vassal and renounce his Christian faith. Edmund, a deeply religious man, vehemently refused, declaring he would rather die than dishonor Christ or his subjects. His refusal sealed his fate. Enraged by his defiance and refusal to submit, the Vikings allegedly tied him to a tree and flogged him. The method of execution, according to legend, was particularly cruel. He was supposedly shot with a shower of arrows, like a hedgehog, until his body was covered in them. After this, his head was allegedly cut off and thrown into a nearby thicket, ensuring there would be no Christian burial. The legend continues with a miraculous touch. After the Vikings departed, Edmund's loyal subjects supposedly found his head being guarded by a wolf, which gently returned it to be reunited with his body. This story, though containing hagiographic elements to sanctify the king, highlights the brutality of the Viking invasion and the strength of Christian faith in the face of a pagan enemy. The date of his death is traditionally accepted as November 20th, 869 AD. The Saga of St. Edmund had a profound impact on the Anglo-Saxon imagination and on subsequent England. He became a venerated martyr and saint whose cult grew exponentially. His burial place at Bury St. Edmunds, named in his honor, became an important pilgrimage center. The story of his martyrdom served as a powerful symbol of Christian resistance against pagan barbarity, inspiring generations and cementing the image of the Vikings as enemies of faith and civilization. This narrative, even with its legendary embellishments, reflects the reality of the terror and devastation that the Great Heathen Army brought with it, and the deep faith that, for some, was the only defense against the encroaching darkness. While the primary focus of the Great Heathen Army was England, the ambition of Viking leaders, including Halfdan Ragnarsson, extended beyond the island's borders. After consolidating his power as King of Jorvik, York, and establishing the foundations for a Viking kingdom in Northumbria, Halfdan did not hesitate to turn his eyes northward to the lands of Scotland. This expansion of his dominion demonstrated not only a desire for more territory and wealth, but also the need to protect the borders of his new kingdom and to eliminate potential threats from neighboring peoples. Chronicles record that, in 875 AD, Halfdan led a large-scale military campaign against the Picts and Britons in what is now Scotland. The Picts, an ancient people inhabiting eastern and northern Scotland, and the Britons of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, in the west, were logical targets for Viking expansion. These kingdoms, like the Anglo-Saxons, were often divided and vulnerable to coordinated attacks. Halfdan's incursion was not merely a raid, it was a campaign of conquest, aiming to extend Jorvik's influence, and perhaps even establish permanent bases or exact tribute from local rulers. Historical sources suggest that Halfdan's campaign in Scotland was militarily successful, inflicting defeats on the Picts and Britons. However, unlike his conquest of Northumbria, he was unable to establish lasting dominion or unify the territory under his command. Scotland was a more difficult terrain, with rugged geography and populations that, despite their divisions, could prove fierce in defending their lands. The Viking presence in northern Great Britain, though significant, remained more fragmented than in the English Danelaw. Halfdan's Scottish campaigns are important for several reasons. They show the constantly shifting power dynamics in the British Isles during the Viking Age, with Norse leaders attempting to expand their empires in all directions. For Halfdan, the campaign may have served to reinforce his authority over his warriors and to demonstrate his strength to Jorvik's neighbors. It may also have been a way to distract Anglo-Saxon forces from Wessex, who still posed a threat in the south. Although Halfdan's gaze towards Scotland did not result in a Viking kingdom as cohesive as Jorvik, these incursions left their mark. They contributed to the destabilization of the Pictish and British kingdoms, paving the way for the eventual rise of the Kingdom of Alba, future Scotland, from the Kingdom of Dal Riata. The Viking presence in the north, though not dominated by a single king like Halfdan, continued to be a relevant force, with settlements in the Orkney, Shetland, and Hebrides Islands. Halfdan's ambition, which led him to try to expand his dominion beyond Northumbria, is a testament to his imperial vision and how the leaders of the Great Heathen Army were much more than mere raiders. The Great Heathen Army, despite its formidable strength and initial success, was not a monolith. It was a coalition of diverse chieftains and clans, united by common objectives: plunder, conquest, and, in some cases, vengeance. However, as campaigns lengthened and success brought vast rewards in land and wealth, internal tensions inevitably began to surface. Viking discipline was largely voluntary, based on loyalty to a charismatic leader and the promise of sharing spoils. When these promises became difficult to fulfill or individual ambitions clashed, discord could spread rapidly. The main source of friction was, naturally, the division of loot, and later conquered lands. With the disintegration of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, vast tracts of land became available. However, who would get what, and who would rule over whom? The rise of Halfdan Ragnarsson as King of Jorvik is a clear example of how a leader broke away to establish his own dominion. But this separation was not always amicable. Other chieftains like Guthrum, Ubbi, and the brothers from other clans had their own aspirations and loyal followers who expected to be rewarded. Historical chronicles, though not always explicit about internal discussions, indicate that the Great Heathen Army divided into factions over time. In 875 AD, after the campaign in Wessex, part of the army, including Halfdan, headed for Northumbria to settle. The other part, under Guthrum and other leaders, remained active in southern and eastern England. This division was not necessarily a sign of open conflict, but a demonstration that different leaders had distinct objectives and priorities for the future. Halfdan wanted a kingdom in the north, while Guthrum still sought the complete subjugation of Wessex. However, at other times, the rivalry was more direct and violent. There are records of clashes between different Viking groups, especially in Ireland, where Halfdan was involved in disputes with other Norse leaders for control of Dublin. The pursuit of preeminence and the coveting of lucrative ports and trade routes led to battles among the Vikings themselves. For many, loyalty was fluid, and a warrior could change allegiance if they saw a better opportunity for fortune or glory. These internal disputes, while weakening the unified force of the Great Heathen Army, also reflected the enterprising and ambitious nature of the Vikings. Each jarl and chieftain sought their own legacy and their own power. This fragmentation, paradoxically, would eventually be an advantage for the Anglo-Saxons in the long run, as it allowed them to face the Vikings in smaller and less cohesive groups, paving the way for the eventual reconquest of England by kings like Alfred and Athelstan. However, while the army was at the height of its power, these tensions were a constant reminder that, even among conquerors, power is always a battlefield. Among the many legends surrounding the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, few are as intriguing and revealing of the Viking mindset as the belief in the power and luck associated with the tomb of Ivar the Boneless. While the exact details of his death and burial place are uncertain for modern historiography, Norse sagas and some chronicles suggest that Ivar was revered even after his death, with his tomb being considered a place of power and protection. According to the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and other medieval Icelandic narratives, Ivar, before he died, allegedly instructed that his body be buried in a prominent place in England, and that as long as his bones remained undisturbed, the country would not be conquered by enemies. The belief was that the presence of his bones conferred protective luck upon the Vikings and an invincible barrier against invaders. This was a manifestation of the strong Norse belief in the magical power of ancestors and their tombs, which could influence the fortune of battle and the destiny of a people. This legend gains further prominence in the Saga of Olav Haraldsson, which recounts an episode centuries later, during the invasion of England by William the Conqueror in 1066. The saga states that, before his famous victory at Hastings, William allegedly came across Ivar's tomb and, aware of the legend and the psychological impact it had on his Norse adversaries, and perhaps on the English themselves, who had a Viking heritage in the Danelaw, ordered Ivar's bones to be exhumed and burned. William's intention, according to the Saga, was to break the spell and demoralize any possible Viking resistance, thus ensuring his own victory. Although the veracity of this episode is highly questionable, it is more likely a later addition to legitimize the Norman conquest and discredit Viking power. It illustrates the strength of Ivar's legend in popular imagination. The belief in the power of Ivar's bones reflects the complex Viking worldview, where the supernatural intertwined with reality. For them, a leader like Ivar, who had demonstrated almost superhuman intelligence and cunning in life, could continue to exert influence after death. The tomb of a great warrior was a sacred place, a point of connection with ancestral realms and a source of haminja, inherent luck or fortune. Even if the story of William and Ivar's bones is more legend than fact, it tells us a lot about Ivar the Boneless's stature and collective memory. He was not just a military leader, but an almost mythical figure whose power transcended life and death. His legend served to inspire and terrify, a reminder that Viking influence over England was profound, not only in the lands they conquered, but also in the stories and beliefs they left behind. The Great Heathen Army, which for a decade terrorized and conquered England, was not a monolithic force. While initially united by common objectives of plunder and conquest, the diversity of ambitions among its leaders and warriors led to an inevitable fragmentation. In 875 AD, this division became more pronounced, marking the end of coexistence and the exile of a part of Halfdan Ragnarsson's army that did not wish to settle permanently in Northumbria. Following Halfdan's consolidation as King of Jorvik, York, and the subsequent distribution of lands to his followers, the nature of Viking dominion in northern England began to change. The life of a colonizer, farmer, and ruler was attractive to many who sought stability and new opportunities. However, for a significant portion of the army, the settled life did not align with their aspirations. Many warriors were nomadic by nature, driven by the thrill of battle, the promise of new plunder, and the glory of conquest. For them, farming and governance seemed monotonous and restrictive. These wandering warriors, or greens, in contrast to the settlers, saw no purpose in staying put. They were drawn by the unplundered riches and the challenges of new kingdoms to be conquered. Tensions grew between Halfdan's faction, which was now focused on building a stable kingdom, and the warriors who still yearned for a life of raids and campaigns. History does not record an open conflict or a violent expulsion by Halfdan. Instead, it appears to have been a natural separation of objectives. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that in 875 AD, a portion of the Viking army left Northumbria and headed south, where they joined other Viking groups or engaged in new campaigns. This movement was crucial, as it meant that Halfdan was solidifying his control over Northumbria, ridding himself of elements that could cause internal instability. By exiling the more restless and plunder-focused elements, Halfdan ensured that his new kingdom could develop on a more stable, agricultural foundation. This division was not unique to Halfdan's army. Similar phenomena occurred in other Viking groups throughout history. The exile of those who did not settle marked a transition from invasion to colonization. From this point onward, the Viking forces in England became more diverse in their intentions. Some sought to establish dominions, others continued to plunder and move. For Halfdan, this was a strategic move that allowed Jorvik to flourish as an independent and prosperous Viking center, while the wandering warriors continued to spread terror and uncertainty across other parts of the island, or even overseas, on new adventures. Coexistence had ended, and the path to settlement was now open. After consolidating his power in Northumbria as King of Jorvik, Halfdan Ragnarsson's ambition was not confined to England's borders. His gaze, like that of many Viking leaders of the era, turned westward, to fertile and strategic Ireland. The Emerald Isle, though politically fragmented into various small Gaelic kingdoms, had become an important center of Viking activity since the early 9th century, with the founding of settlements like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. Dublin in particular had established itself as a prosperous trading post and a crucial Viking military base. Irish sources, such as the Annals of Ulster, record Halfdan's arrival in Ireland in 877 AD, where he became directly involved in the struggle for control of Dublin. The city was not just a starting point for raids, but a center for the trade of slaves, silver, and other valuable goods, making it a coveted prize. At that time, Dublin was ruled by a Norse dynasty, the Ui Emer, or descendants of Ivar, who considered themselves heirs of the legendary Ivar the Boneless. Halfdan's arrival, also a son of Ragnar in the sagas, represented a direct challenge to this hegemony. Halfdan's motivation for invading Ireland and fighting for Dublin may have been multifaceted. He sought to expand his dominion and influence beyond England, secure new sources of wealth, and perhaps even claim a legacy from his supposed brother Ivar, who also had a strong presence in Ireland. Control of Dublin would give him access to lucrative trade routes and a base for future campaigns, strengthening his position across the Irish Sea. Halfdan's campaign in Ireland was marked by a direct confrontation with Barid mac Emer, or Barid Ivarsson, a prominent Viking leader of the Ui Emer dynasty, and possibly a nephew or close relative of the legendary Ivar the Boneless. This was not a war between Vikings and Gaels, but an internecine war between Norse factions, vying for control of the lucrative settlements. The power struggle between these Viking chieftains was common. Glory and wealth were finite, and only the strongest and most cunning could reign supreme. Halfdan's involvement in Ireland demonstrates the breadth of Viking ambition and the interconnectivity of Norse communities in the British Isles. Leaders like him saw no rigid borders, and their spheres of influence could extend over vast distances. The struggle for Dublin was a bloody chapter in Halfdan's history, which would culminate in his end, but which also highlights Ireland's importance as a crucial stage for Viking expansion and conflict in the 9th century. His presence in Ireland solidifies his image as a relentless leader, determined to shape his own empire. The city of Dublin, with its strategic location on Ireland's east coast, became, from the 9th century onwards, one of the most important and lasting Viking settlements outside Scandinavia. Unlike the conquest of entire kingdoms as in England, the Viking presence in Ireland was characterized by the founding of coastal city-states, the long forts, which served as bases for trade and plunder, and by the establishment of a complex web of alliances and rivalries with the native Gaelic kings. The history of the kings of Dublin is therefore a family saga, marked by an endless cycle of conquest, exile, return, and fratricidal power struggles. The most prominent dynasty that ruled Dublin was the Ui Emer, or descendants of Ivar, named after Ivar the Boneless, a legendary and historical figure whose activities in Ireland and England are widely documented. Ivar, who may have died in Ireland in 873 AD, is considered the patriarch of this lineage that would dominate Dublin for generations. His sons and grandsons, like Olafur Konung, Emer, Ivar himself, Awisla, and others, were the first to establish and govern the Long Fort of Dublin, transforming it from a fortified camp into a prosperous port city. Succession to the throne of Dublin was frequently violent. Brothers fought against brothers, nephews against uncles, and alliances could change overnight. The line of succession was not linear, and power often passed to the strongest and most influential warrior. These internal disputes were exacerbated by the constant need to defend the city from Gaelic attacks, and by rivalry with other Viking chieftains who sought control of Dublin's lucrative trade route and port. The arrival of Halfdan Ragnarsson in 877 AD, seeking to usurp the Ui Emer dynasty's power, is a classic example of these internal struggles that defined Viking Irish politics. The kings of Dublin were not just warriors, they were also shrewd traders, and gradually became essential elements in Irish politics. They engaged in complex alliances with Gaelic kings, sometimes fighting alongside them against other Vikings, other times plundering their territories. Over time, some of them converted to Christianity, although adherence to paganism and Norse tradition remained strong. Dublin's wealth was remarkable, attracting merchants from all over Europe and generating a vibrant economy based on the trade of slaves, silver, textiles, and spices. The saga of the kings of Dublin extended for centuries, with ups and downs, exiles, and triumphant returns. Although Dublin was occasionally expelled by the Gaels, the Vikings always found a way to return, reaffirming their presence. This complex tapestry of conflict and cooperation made Dublin a unique center of Norse Gaelic culture, a testament to the Vikings' resilience and adaptability. The history of Dublin's monarchs is a chronicle of power, betrayal, and the persistence of a lineage that left an indelible mark on Ireland and on the interconnectedness of the Viking world. The arrival of Halfdan Ragnarsson in Ireland in 877 AD and his subsequent bid for control of Dublin were not a smooth affair. He met a formidable adversary in Barid mac Emer, also known as Barid or Barid Ivarsson, a prominent Viking leader of the Ui Emer dynasty, and possibly a nephew or close relative of the legendary Ivar the Boneless. The rivalry between Halfdan and Barid is a classic example of the violent internal struggles that often characterize the pursuit of power among Norse chieftains. Barid mac Emer, like Halfdan, was an experienced warrior and an ambitious leader. He had established a strong position in Dublin, controlling the lucrative trade routes and surrounding territories. The Ui Emer dynasty considered Dublin their rightful domain, and Halfdan's attempt to usurp it was a direct affront to their authority and lineage. Confrontation was inevitable. Irish chronicles, such as the Annals of Ulster, record that Halfdan led his forces against Barids in a series of skirmishes and confrontations. The dispute over the port and its riches was fierce, and both sides were determined to prevail. Dublin was not just a matter of prestige, but of economic and strategic power. It was a vital port, a trading post that connected Scandinavia, the British Isles, and mainland Europe. Whoever controlled Dublin controlled an immense flow of wealth, including the trade of slaves, silver, and luxury goods. The rivalry intensified, culminating in a decisive battle. Although the annals do not provide minute details about the tactics or duration of the conflict, they are clear about the outcome. Halfdan's ambition to extend his empire to Ireland clashed with Barid's determination to defend his domain. The confrontation between the two Viking leaders represented a struggle for the future of Norse control in Ireland. This rivalry highlights the fluid and brutal nature of Viking politics. Loyalty was often contingent on strength and success, and leaders were willing to fight to the death for their share of power. For Halfdan, the conquest of Dublin would be a testament to his ability to govern and his claim to inherit the legacy of his supposed father, Ragnar, and his brother Ivar. For Barid, it was the defense of his family's heritage and his own kingdom. The confrontation between Barid and Halfdan is another reminder that the Vikings were not a monolithic bloc. Their individual interests and ambitions often put them in conflict with each other, even when they shared a common culture and origin. The struggle for Dublin was a bloody chapter in Halfdan's saga, one that had a fatal outcome for him, but which also shaped the complex tapestry of Norse dominion in Ireland, paving the way for future kings of Dublin and the persistence of the Ui Emer dynasty. Halfdan Ragnarsson's ambitious campaign in Ireland, driven by the desire to control the lucrative trading post of Dublin and extend his dominion beyond England, culminated in his tragic and decisive end at the Battle of Strangford Lough in 877 AD. This confrontation was not just another skirmish in the long history of Viking invasions. It was the stage where the ambition of the first Viking king of Jorvik met its limit, resulting in his death and the consequent weakening of his nascent empire. After his arrival in Ireland and his engagement in the rivalry for control of Dublin, Halfdan found himself in direct confrontation with the forces of Barid mac Emer, a prominent Viking leader of the Ui Emer dynasty who controlled the city. The dispute over the port and its riches was fierce, and both sides were determined to prevail. The Annals of Ulster, one of the primary sources for this period, record the event with grim conciseness. Halfdan was killed in a battle against the Dubgail, dark foreigners, or Danes at Lough Cuan, Strangford Lough. While the tactical details of the battle are scarce in historical sources, the mention of Lough Cuan, Strangford Lough, a large sea lough or fjord in modern-day Northern Ireland, indicates that the confrontation occurred in a coastal environment, possibly involving ships or the water's edge. This suggests a naval engagement or a contested landing, leveraging Viking familiarity with amphibious warfare. Halfdan's defeat by the Dubgail, a term distinguishing the Danes or Dark Vikings from the Fingail, the Fair Vikings, usually Norwegians, suggests that he was overcome by a rival Viking faction, perhaps allied with Gaelic chieftains, or simply a superior force of the Dublin Vikings themselves, or from other parts of Ireland. Halfdan's death was a significant blow to his aspirations and to the Viking kingdom he'd established in Jorvik. His vision of a trans-Irish and English empire was abruptly cut short. News of his death would have reverberated throughout the Danelaw and Scandinavia, reminding everyone of the volatility of a Viking leader's life and the relentless brutality of the power game. For the Anglo-Saxons, the news may have brought brief relief, a glimpse of hope that the Viking threat could be contained, although the reality was that other leaders would emerge to fill the vacuum. The Battle of Strangford Lough, though not as famous as Ashdown or Edington, is a crucial landmark in Halfdan Ragnarsson's history. It was the final point of his journey as a conqueror and king, a reminder that even the most ambitious and capable Viking leaders could find their ultimate fate far from home, in the lands they sought to dominate. Halfdan's defeat and death left a power vacuum in Jorvik, which would lead to a period of instability before new Viking kings emerged to rule the Northumbrian capital. Halfdan's saga ended there, but his legacy of colonization and the founding of Jorvik would endure. Halfdan Ragnarsson's death at the Battle of Strangford Lough in 877 AD, though it did not cause the immediate collapse of all Viking dominion in England, had a significant impact on Norse leadership and the kingdoms he had helped establish. Halfdan was no ordinary leader. He was one of the three main commanders of the Great Heathen Army, the first to settle and declare himself king on English soil. His loss, therefore, created a power vacuum and destabilized Jorvik's newly formed structure. Firstly, Halfdan's death demonstrated the fragility of Viking leadership. In an era of constant wars and individual ambitions, although he succeeded in forging a kingdom, his authority largely depended on his own strength and military capability. His sudden absence meant that the kingdom of Jorvik was left without a strong and undisputed leader, paving the way for internal disputes and an uncertain succession. The annals of Ulster record that after Halfdan's death, his Dubgail, Danish Vikings, were defeated and dispersed in Ireland, showing the direct impact of their leader's loss. In Northumbria, the immediate impact was a phase of instability. Without Halfdan, the kingdom of Jorvik entered a period of political uncertainty. Historical sources indicate that, after his death, control over Jorvik was assumed by a series of lesser-known Viking leaders, or nameless kings for a time, before more prominent figures, such as Ragnar and Eric Bloodaxe, emerged in the 10th century. This suggests a power struggle and a lack of cohesion that could have been avoided had Halfdan lived to further consolidate his reign. Furthermore, Halfdan's death served as a reminder to other Viking leaders of the lethality of their own ambitions. Ireland, with its multiple Norse factions and Gaelic kingdoms, was a dangerous terrain for expansion. Although the Viking presence in Ireland continued, Halfdan's fate underscored the inherent risks of a life of conquest. His death may also have influenced the strategies of other leaders, like Guthrum, who, instead of seeking expansion in all directions, chose to settle more firmly in East Anglia and make peace with Alfred. For the Norse kingdoms of Scandinavia, the death of such a prominent chieftain was a significant event. While it did not have an immediate direct impact on the power dynamic there, it contributed to the complex tapestry of legends and family lineages that defined Viking society. Halfdan was remembered as one of the great sons of Ragnar, a warrior who forged a kingdom in foreign lands. Even if his reign was abruptly cut short, his loss did not end the Viking Age, but it marked the close of an important chapter in its history in England and Ireland, with new leaders and power dynamics emerging to fill the vacuum left by his departure. Halfdan Ragnarsson's death in 877 AD, during at the Battle of Strangford Lough, left the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, York, in a state of power vacuum and uncertainty. Just a year after Halfdan had proclaimed himself king and distributed lands to his followers, the absence of a strong and undisputed leader generated immediate and significant consequences for the newly formed Norse political entity in Northumbria. The first and most obvious consequence was succession instability. Halfdan, as the first established Viking king, had not had time to consolidate a robust dynasty or to name a clear and unquestionable heir who could assume command peacefully. In a Viking society where strength and charisma were often the main criteria for leadership, Halfdan's absence opened the way for disputes among other chieftains and jarls who had remained in Jorvik or who saw an opportunity for ascension. Chronicles do not record an immediate successor, but rather a period of nameless kings or transitional rulers, indicating a lack of centralized authority and possibly a collective regency or a rapid succession of lesser leaders. Secondly, the power vacuum led to a decrease in the kingdom's cohesion. Halfdan's vision of a permanent settlement and an organized kingdom was what held many of the settlers and warriors together. With his death, part of that unity dissolved. Although colonization itself continued, Jorvik's ability to launch large offensive campaigns or to maintain tight control over its peripheral territories may have been compromised. This opened the door for local Anglo-Saxon factions, especially in Bernicia, northern Northumbria, to reassert some form of autonomy, even if still under the shadow of Viking power. Furthermore, Halfdan's death meant that the focus of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik shifted more towards defense and maintenance than aggressive expansion. Although the city of York continued to be a vital and prosperous center, its potential for imperial growth was temporarily curtailed. The Jorvik Vikings needed to dedicate more energy to internal organization and protection against possible Anglo-Saxon counterattacks from the south. However, it's crucial to note that the Viking kingdom of Jorvik did not collapse after Halfdan's death. The foundations he had established, the settlement, the minting of coins, the organization of the land, were strong enough to persist. Although there was a period of turbulence, Jorvik would continue to be a significant Viking kingdom for decades, before eventually being incorporated into a unified England. Halfdan's loss was a setback, but the seed of a Norse kingdom had been planted, and it would continue to grow, even under new leadership and amidst new uncertainties. The power vacuum was a challenge, but Viking resilience would ensure that Jorvik remained a bastion of their culture in England. While the Viking kingdom of Jorvik dealt with the power vacuum after Halfdan Ragnarsson's death, in the south of England, Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, continued his relentless struggle for survival and, ultimately, for reconquest. Halfdan's death may have brought a brief respite, but the Viking threat was far from over. The Great Heathen Army had split, but its remnants, under the leadership of figures like Guthrum, still represented a formidable force and an existential threat to Wessex and the future of Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred was a singular monarch, not just a courageous warrior, but a cunning strategist and a visionary reformer. After paying the Danegeld in 871 AD to buy precious time, he did not waste the opportunity. He knew that peace was temporary and that the Vikings would return. His strategy was not only defensive but proactive, aiming not just to repel, but to defeat and contain the Norse threat. One of his most important reforms was the reorganization of the fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia. Instead of calling up the entire army for long campaigns, which exhausted the economy and workforce, Alfred divided it into two parts, which would take turns in service. This ensured that a force was always available for combat, while the other half could tend to agriculture and the economy. He also invested in building a network of burhs, strategically located fortified towns that served as refuges, military bases, and trade centers. These burhs were crucial for the kingdom's defense and for creating a robust defensive infrastructure. The climax of Alfred's resistance came in the winter of 878 AD, through when Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, forcing Alfred to hide in the marshes of Athelney. This was the lowest point of his reign, a moment of desperation where Wessex's survival seemed uncertain. However, Alfred did not give up. He regrouped, gathered a new army, and in the spring of 878 AD, confronted Guthrum at the decisive Battle of Edington. The victory at Edington was overwhelming, a triumph that not only saved Wessex, but also changed the course of English history. After Edington, Alfred imposed the Treaty of Wedmore, which formalized the division of England between Anglo-Saxon territory and the Danelaw. This treaty was not a defeat for Alfred, but a diplomatic victory. He recognized the Viking settlement in parts of England, but also set clear limits on their expansion, and demanded that Guthrum convert to Christianity. Alfred the Great's resistance was not just a series of battles. It was a decade-long struggle that saved Anglo-Saxon culture, laid the foundations for the unification of England, and transformed a besieged kingdom into a rising power. His persistence and vision were the perfect counterpoint to the Vikings' rampant ambition. The decisive victory of Alfred the Great over the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD did not result in the total expulsion of the Vikings from England, but rather in one of the most important agreements in Anglo-Saxon history, the Treaty of Wedmore. This treaty, concluded shortly after the battle, formalized the division of England into two distinct spheres of influence and laid the groundwork for the coexistence, albeit tense, between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Far from being a surrender, it was a diplomatic triumph for Alfred, who ensured the survival of his kingdom and established clear limits for Viking expansion. The main term of the Treaty of Wedmore was the demand that Guthrum and 29 of his leading Viking chieftains convert to Christianity. For Alfred, a deeply religious monarch, this conversion was not just a symbolic gesture, but an attempt to integrate the Vikings into the Anglo-Saxon cultural and political sphere, making them more predictable and, ideally, less prone to raiding Christian kingdoms. Guthrum was baptized with a Christian name Ethelstan, with Alfred himself acting as his godfather. This conversion, though perhaps initially pragmatic on Guthrum's part, had a significant impact on the gradual Christianization of the Danelaw areas. The treaty also outlined the boundaries of the Danelaw, the area of England under Viking control, the lands east of the line running from the Thames, following the River Lee to Luton, and then across Bedford to the River Ouse, and thence to Chester, though the exact lines are subject to historical debate, would be Viking dominion. The lands to the west and south of this line would remain under the control of Alfred and Wessex. This territorial demarcation was crucial. It recognized the Viking presence, but also established a zone of peace and, at least in theory, would prevent further Viking incursions into Anglo-Saxon Wessex territory. In addition to the boundaries and conversion, the treaty established terms for peace and commercial relations between the two spheres. It included clauses on the exchange of hostages and the prohibition of new incursions. Although the peace was not perfect and intermittent conflicts continued to occur, the Treaty of Wedmore was a landmark. It ended the initial and most chaotic phase of the Great Heathen Army's invasions and established a modus vivendi. For Alfred, the treaty was a consecration of his vision of a strong and resilient Wessex. He not only defended his kingdom, but ensured its autonomy and the possibility of recovery. For Guthrum and the Vikings, the treaty offered legitimacy for their settlements and the opportunity to build permanent kingdoms in England, like Halfdan's in Jorvik. The Treaty of Wedmore, therefore, was not just a document. It was a testament to Anglo-Saxon tenacity and Viking adaptability, which together would shape the future of England, establishing a border that, for a time, would divide the island and forge new identities. Although his life ended abruptly in Ireland, Halfdan Ragnarsson's legacy as the first Viking king of Jorvik is immense and indelible in the formation of Norse identity in Northumbria. His vision of permanent settlement and an established kingdom, in contrast to continuous plunder, was a catalyst for a cultural, social, and political transformation that would mark northern England for centuries. Halfdan was not just a warrior, he was a founder, and his influence extends far beyond his brief reign. Firstly, Halfdan was the architect of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik. By proclaiming himself king and distributing lands to his warriors, he laid the groundwork for a political entity that was not just a military camp, but a sovereign state with its own administration, economy, and eventually, its own dynasty of Norse rulers. This decision to settle transformed the Vikings from ephemeral invaders into permanent colonizers, rooting Norse culture in the Northumbrian landscape. His leadership in the settlement spurred large-scale Viking colonization. Thousands of Scandinavians, attracted by the promise of land and the stability offered by the new kingdom, migrated to Northumbria. This mass migration had a profound demographic and cultural impact. Old Norse began to mix with Old English, resulting in countless place names with Norse suffixes, such as by and thorpe, and a lasting influence on the vocabulary of modern English. Beyond language, the influence of Halfdan and his successors manifested in the legal system of the Danelaw. Norse laws and customs merged with Anglo-Saxon ones, creating a distinct body of law that reflected the coexistence of the two cultures. Northumbria's economy itself was revitalized, with Jorvik becoming a vibrant commercial center that connected England to the vast Viking trade world, extending from Scandinavia to Russia and the Mediterranean. The minting of Jorvik coins, initiated under Halfdan, symbolized this new prosperity and autonomy. The Viking identity in Northumbria, shaped by Halfdan's vision, was unique. It was not a simple replica of Scandinavia, nor merely an extension of Anglo-Saxon England. It was a hybrid culture, a fusion of Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions, which manifested in art, architecture, burial practices, and the very composition of society. This identity persisted even after the eventual Anglo-Saxon reconquest, with the Danelaw maintaining its cultural and legal distinctions for centuries. Thus, Halfdan Ragnarson's legacy is that of a pioneer. He was the first to translate Viking military might into lasting state power in England. His ambition and vision not only changed the course of Northumbrian history, but also fundamentally contributed to the complex tapestry of English identity, proving that the Vikings were much more than just raiders. They were also kingdom builders. His mark, even in death, remained forever on the soil and in the culture of northern England. The city of Jorvik, formerly Eoforwic, conquered by Halfdan Ragnarsson and transformed into his capital, transcended the death of its founder to establish itself as the undisputed center of the Danelaw in northern England. Even after Halfdan's loss in 877 AD, Jorvik maintained its lasting importance as an independent Viking kingdom for almost a century, irreversibly shaping the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the region. Jorvik's status as the capital of the Danelaw was not merely symbolic. It was a pragmatic reality. Its strategic location at the confluence of rivers and its access to the sea made it an ideal commercial hub. Under Viking rule, Jorvik flourished as a vibrant trading post, connecting England to the vast Norse commercial world. Goods from across Europe and beyond, such as furs, timber, slaves, grain, spices, and crafts, passed through its markets. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate revealed a bustling city, with numerous artisan workshops, demonstrating a robust and diversified economy. Politically, Jorvik functioned as an autonomous kingdom, governed by a succession of Viking kings who, though sometimes coming from Scandinavia or Ireland, like Eric Bloodaxe, consolidated their own identity for the kingdom. While there were periods of instability and succession disputes, the institution of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik remained resilient. The minting of coins with its own monarchs and Norse symbols, distinct from Anglo-Saxon coinage, is irrefutable proof of its sovereignty and independence. This autonomy allowed Jorvik to pursue its own foreign policy, forming alliances and waging wars with both Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and other Norse groups in Ireland and Scotland. Culturally, Jorvik was a true melting pot. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norse cultures resulted in a hybrid society where laws, customs, and languages mixed. The Norse influence was felt in place names, legal practices, like the wapentake, and of course in the English language, which absorbed countless words and grammatical structures from Old Norse. Norse paganism, though gradually supplanted by Christianity, left its marks on popular beliefs and practices, and churches in Jorvik often incorporated Viking artistic and iconographic elements. Jorvik's importance as the center of the Danelaw persisted until the mid-10th century. Its eventual fall to the Anglo-Saxon kings, notably Athelstan and Edred, marked the end of independent Viking rule in England and was a crucial step towards the unification of England. However, even after the reconquest, Jorvik's Viking identity and legacy did not disappear. The city maintained its distinct character, and the Norse heritage continued to influence the region for centuries. Halfdan's vision of transforming a conquered city into a center of Viking power gave Jorvik a lasting importance that would make it one of the most fascinating examples of Norse settlement outside Scandinavia. The impact of the Great Heathen Army and the legacy of leaders like Halfdan Ragnarsson were not limited to the conquest of lands and the establishment of kingdoms. The true depth of Viking influence in England lies in the future generations of Norse people born and raised on English soil, and in the gradual fusion of their cultures with the Anglo-Saxon. The descendants of Viking warriors and settlers not only continued to inhabit the Danelaw, but became an integral part of England's social fabric, shaping its demography, culture, and even its genetic identity. After the settlement, especially in Northumbria, the Kingdom of Jorvik and East Anglia, the Vikings did not remain as a foreign occupying force. They intermarried with Anglo-Saxon women, established families, and gave birth to a new generation of individuals who were both Norse and English. These descendants spoke a version of English already heavily influenced by Old Norse, adapted customs from both cultures, and in many cases converted to Christianity, while retaining remnants of their ancestral pagan traditions. The lives of these future generations were marked by coexistence and continuous interaction with the Anglo-Saxon population. While there were occasional tensions and conflicts, the need to work the land, trade, and build communities led to a considerable degree of integration. The children and grandchildren of the first invaders were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and even military and political leaders in their own right. They did not necessarily see themselves as Vikings in the original sense of raiders, but as inhabitants of a new land with a dual heritage. The legacy of figures like Halfdan manifested in the laws and customs that persisted in the Danelaw. The wapentake system, for example, remained in use, and many Norse legal and agricultural practices were incorporated. The language, as already mentioned, was profoundly altered, and place names throughout the Danelaw, such as those with suffixes by, from beer, settlement, or farm, or thorp, from thorp, village, are a lasting testament to this presence. Even after the Anglo-Saxon reconquest of England in the 10th century, the Norse identity did not disappear. The Danelaw areas maintained their cultural and legal particularities for a long time. Later English kings, such as Ethelred the Unready and Cnut the Great, who became King of England and of a vast North Sea empire, had to deal with the population of Viking descent and often incorporated them into their governments. The fusion of elites and peoples continued, culminating in the eventual formation of a more cohesive English identity, but one intrinsically influenced by the Vikings. Ultimately, the descendants of Halfdan and other Vikings in England were not just a group of people. They were a driving force of change that transformed Anglo-Saxon society and contributed to the rich cultural tapestry of England. They were proof that the Viking conquest was not just about plunder, but about establishing a new home, a legacy that continues to resonate in the traditions, language, and even the names of people in the United Kingdom today. In one of history's greatest ironies, the Viking settlements in England, initiated by leaders like Halfdan Ragnarsson and the Great Heathen Army with the goal of conquest and fragmentation, ultimately played a crucial and paradoxical role in the eventual unification of England under a single king. What began as a devastating invasion ultimately culminated, in the long term, in an impetus for the consolidation of a stronger and more cohesive Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Initially, the Viking presence dismantled the Heptarchy, the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia fell under Norse rule, forming the Danelaw. This fragmentation seemed to be the end of Anglo-Saxon England. However, by concentrating the threat and creating a clear border with the Danelaw, the Vikings inadvertently forced the Kingdom of Wessex, under the command of Alfred the Great, to organize and strengthen itself as never before. The struggle against a common, powerful, and implacable enemy generated a cohesion and sense of identity among the remaining Anglo-Saxons that had not previously existed to such a degree. Alfred's military and administrative reforms, such as the creation of the boors, fortified towns, and the reorganization of the fyrd, militia, were direct responses to the Viking threat. These innovations not only protected Wessex, but also created a model of governance and defense that would be extended to all English territory as it was reconquered. The existence of the Danelaw provided a clear and tangible objective for the generations of Wessex kings who succeeded Alfred: the reconquest of the lost lands and the unification of all English peoples under a single crown. Alfred's successors, such as his son Edward the Elder, and especially his grandson Athelstan, embraced this mission with vigor. They systematically reconquered the Danelaw, town by town, kingdom by kingdom. In doing so, they not only reintegrated these territories but also incorporated elements of Viking administration and culture. Athelstan, with his overwhelming victory at the Battle of Brunanburh, 937 AD, against a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Britons, consolidated his dominion over the entirety of England, often being hailed as the first king of all England. Crucially, the Viking presence and eventual coexistence led to cultural and social fusion. The introduction of new ideas, the revitalization of trade in centers like Jorvik, and the intermarriage of populations themselves contributed to a more dynamic and complex society. The unification of England was not simply a return to the pre-invasion state. It was the creation of something new, a nation that had absorbed and adapted to its Norse heritage. The laws of the Danelaw, for example, were often maintained or adapted after the Reconquest, and Viking linguistic influence is felt in English to this day. Therefore, the Viking settlements, though initially a force of disunity, paved the way for a stronger, more unified, and culturally rich England. They forced the Anglo-Saxons to adapt, innovate, and unite in the face of a common threat, creating a kingdom capable of consolidating itself and eventually becoming one of Europe's most powerful nations. Halfdan's ambition to forge a Viking kingdom ironically helped shape the destiny of a much larger nation.